right, gang, so we're moving to a new but related topic today. We're going to be talking about elephants and ivory. So I think this will be fun, a little light, but clearly we need to look at this through the lens of economics. Now, I have given to you a handout that only has the slides with graphics or stuff that you don't want to have to write down word for word for word. It does not mean you do not have to take notes. You will not have sufficient information, so you should have your notebook out. But you do want to maybe number the slides on your handout and reference them in your notes. So as you get to something and we're talking about it, you might say, see slide number 1, see slide number 2. But do make sure you get detailed notes, because I will not be posting my notes, but I will hopefully have a decent recording, except for I'm wearing a mask, and so who knows if I sound like a human being. So let's get started. What we want to do in this unit is talk about our concerns about the African elephant. And I'm going to be talking specifically about the African elephant, but I do want to note that a lot of what we're talking about relates to the Asian elephants as well. The situation's a little different, so you'll see me refer to Asian elephants here and there, but the real action right now is the African elephant. We're also going to talk about how this concern for elephants connects to the ivory trade. Clearly, ivory being valuable causes a lot of the concern about the African elephant. So these go hand in hand. We need to talk about the United Nations' attempt to control ivory trade. So what have they done to try to protect the elephant by addressing ivory trade specifically? So we'll talk about some of those attempts. And we want to talk about a really innovative program called Campfire. That's an abbreviation for something that's long, and we'll get to that later. But this innovative elephant management program in Zimbabwe, which I think is highly controversial, but I think you'll find it very interesting. And then finally, whether it's in this lecture or you'll see another lecture that relates, and maybe some readings as well, but we need to talk about some of the recent developments in ivory trade, because there's been kind of some more recent emergence of ivory trade. We'll talk about with who and why we're seeing this emergence of trade, and specific concerns about this situation. So first, why the African elephant? Well, that's our topic, not so much Asian elephant, but as I said, some of this does apply to the Asian elephant, and I'll be making some connections here and there. But in case you've never seen an Asian elephant, my students who go to Thailand do see a number of Asian elephants, but Asian elephants are smaller, and if you don't know what you're looking at, Asian elephants have little ears, African elephants have big ears. And not all Asian elephants have tusks. So if you have Asian elephants that don't all have tusks, then this whole demand for ivory situation, which would be the reason for killing an elephant often, not the only reason, it's not quite as problematic. So in the Asian elephant species, only some of the male Asian elephants have tusks. So I have seen many elephants in Thailand that are without tusks. So if you don't have tusks, it does decrease the risk. I don't want to claim that it eliminates the risk. If you're an Asian elephant, there might be other reasons that you are being killed, but it's not generally for your ivory if you're a female elephant or a male species that doesn't have a tusk. All right, you get the idea. But still some concerns, and we'll talk about those. Also, the Asian elephants have been protected since 1975, and you're going to see in a related lecture that they were actually protected just a little bit earlier than the African elephant. But we do see, again, this growing concern now about what's going on. So let's connect this to some of the topics that we've already mentioned in this class. Specifically, what kind of resource is the African elephant? Well, it's kind of like the bald eagle, right? It's kind of like the bald eagle. Do we agree that with the bald eagle and with the African elephant, in most cases, there's a lack of property rights, right? There's no private property rights. There's not really generally even communal property rights in the normal setting. So we have an absence of private property rights. So, in general, when we think about the bald eagle, when we think about the African elephant, no one owns those elephants. Now, we're going to talk about this innovative program that changes that, but I'm talking about in general, before we do any of these innovative elephant management types of changes. So nobody owns these elephants. So does everyone agree what we have here is a tragedy of the commons? Yeah? Tragedy of the commons? So we all understand the tragedy of the commons. So if you were asked to explain the tragedy of the commons back to me, hopefully you're talking about that. Lack of private property rights means that everyone's trying to, benefit themselves, that we're all pursuing our rational self-interest, right? And in doing so, by promoting our rational self-interest, we might destroy a shared resource. So if we're all out there trying to make the most money, trying to get ivory, which is highly valuable now, and we'll go through some ivory prices so you get a sense of what has happened to ivory prices, that we might all pursue our rational self-interest. So we're killing too many elephants, trying to make a buck. I get it. Now, a term that we should add here might be open access resource. Open access resource. So this is generally an open access resource until we have laws that prohibit killing of these species. Then it's a very different situation. But kind of like fish in the sea, fish in the sea are an open access resource. So if we don't have any rules initially about elephants and people don't own them, it might be what we call an open access resource. So then in this situation, guys, who's responsible for protection? Who's responsible for protecting the elephant? Are individuals, are private citizens generally responsible for protecting? Is it in their rational self-interest most of the time to protect elephants? No. So it's not going to fall to individuals. It may not fall to communities. Instead, if we want to protect an open access resource, it's going to come down to who? What was that? I think somebody just said it. Governments, right? Governments will have to establish rules, laws, have monitoring. And does everyone agree? That's all expensive, right? It's not cheap to manage a species federally. Luckily for the bald eagle, what keeps the bald eagle safe? What keeps the bald eagle safe? Because it's, in a sense, no property rights. What keeps the bald eagle safe? Anybody? Yeah? Was that? It can't be hunted, so there are rules. Good. If we didn't have rules protecting the bald eagle, do you think we'd be out there poaching the bald eagle? Why not? It doesn't have this intrinsic value, right? Now maybe if somebody determined that the bald eagle's something or other fights cancer, then that poor bald eagle is going to get poached, right? But it doesn't have anything of intrinsic value, so that might be enough to protect it, unlike these poor elephants with very valuable ivory. Ben? It's also a symbol of the United States, so it would feel really horrible. The average person maybe wouldn't act in that way. But if the bald eagle was good for medicine that cured cancer, do you think we'd care about that it's a symbol of the United States? Or would we be like killing the crap out of that thing, right? We'd be hunting it, for sure. So let's talk about concerns about the elephant population. Concerns about the elephant population. First thing, we have seen drastic decreases in the number of elephants in Africa, Asia too. We've seen drastic decreases in the number of elephants. So we're seeing a quickly dwindling population, and that's of concern. At the same time, we've been seeing very high volumes of ivory trade. Do you think they go hand in hand, folks? Is it just a correlation? Or is there a causal story here? Most likely there's a causal story, right? And everyone understands what I mean when I say, is there a correlation or a causal relationship, right? Correlation, two things happen to move together, but one doesn't necessarily cause the other. But here, most likely, one's causing the other. That this high volume of ivory trade, because ivory's been fetching really high prices, is causing people to do more poaching. We've also seen a rise in the demand for ivory. So that's not going to be good for the elephants when the demand for ivory is rising. Clearly, that's going to be additionally problematic. So studies predicted extinction for this African elephant if big measures weren't taken. So small measures weren't going to be enough. We need some big measures, or we're looking at extinction for the African elephant. Now, one confounding factor that made the situation worse was scarcity of older elephants. Scarcity of older elephants. That we were seeing the population skewed towards younger elephants, and we were seeing a scarcity of older elephants. So guys, why might that be a factor? Let's hear from some other people. Who hasn't talked? Brooke, I'm going to pick on you. Why might scarcity of older elephants matter?
The older elephants know how to take care of the younger ones.
Okay.
They're not.
Okay. Good theory. And guys, I'm not a biologist, so we have somebody in the room that may know more than me. So you jump in when you think you know something, but maybe the older elephants are good at taking care of and protecting the younger elephants. Good. I haven't read that that's the case, so that's not what I'm going for, but I think that's a great story, and you might be right. Nick, anything else?
Reproduction.
Okay, could be tied to reproduction. There could be some reproductive issues that when we have a scarcity of older elephants, maybe they don't reproduce as much. And again, could be true. I've not read that, so I can't confirm or disprove that. Gracia?
Because they can't just go out and kill the older elephants. Kill the younger ones.
Okay, so they can't go kill the older elephants. Instead, they have to kill the younger elephants. All right, but why does that make the situation worse? You're on the right track, I think. Anyone? So we're on the right track. Okay, so there's not as many older elephants, which means you've got to go kill the younger elephants, which could matter for reproductive issues. What else?
Do tusks grow?
Do tusks grow? That's a great question. Do tusks grow, guys? Yes, they do. So where are you going with this, Nick?
Older elephants have larger tusks.
Older elephants have larger tusks. Good. Older elephants have larger tusks. So, for the same weight of ivory, what do you have to do? Kill more elephants. So, the scarcity of older elephants means that you have to have more kills in order to get the same weight. So let's think about a ton of ivory. You've now got to kill more elephants. And I actually found some interesting data on this. So in 1979, to obtain 1 ton of ivory, it took 54 elephants, because we didn't see such a scarcity of the older elephants who have the bigger tusks. But by 1987, 1 ton of ivory was taking 105 elephants, because they were younger, smaller, and had smaller tusks. So that's made the situation worse, the scarcity of older elephants. So we see this data. There's plenty of places that you can find graphics that look like this. But this right here is showing us the population estimated of the African elephant. And way on the left, and this is the first slide that you see on your handout, in the earliest 20th century, we've got a ton of elephants. So somewhere around 10 million elephants. But as you see, by 1979, we had cut this population back so far, because it was an open access resource and people wanted to trade in ivory, and that population has continued to dwindle. So in 2016, it's estimated that we had somewhere around 352,000 elephants, down from 10 million. So this is a drastic decrease. And then if you look far to the right on this graphic, in that gray, you see a forecast, right? 2025. And so that forecast, I'm sure, is assuming that if we don't make drastic changes, then we're going to see the elephant population quickly shrink, right? Because that's only 9 years later, 5 years from now as we record this. Seen another way, simple graphic. Top half of this graphic shows 1930, and the second half shows 2019. So we're talking about hugely decreasing populations. So that's pretty amazing. So let's talk about the risks to elephants, some of which you already clearly understand. If we're talking about the risks to elephants, of course, at the top of the list has to be poaching. Poaching. And I know you already understand that the goal for poachers is to obtain the ivory. And so often they leave the carcasses behind. They're not harvesting the meat or the bones and the skin and all the other things that could be done with the animal, but they're simply taking the ivory and leaving the carcass behind. But I don't want to discount that there are some elephant kills because they want the meat. And in Asia, there are species that are used for medicine. So maybe you want body parts for medicine. So I don't want to make it sound like the only reason that somebody kills an elephant is for their ivory, but clearly that would be one of the greatest risks. So what kinds of things, guys, might influence the level of poaching? If you're thinking like an economist and you want to think about what might influence how much poaching is taking place, what kinds of variables do you think matter? So, Kelsey, you want to give me one? So you're thinking about poaching. What kind of variables might influence how much poaching you do, what your ability to be successful at poaching? What things might matter? We'll come back to you. Jake?
Investment in like policing in that area?
Ah, okay. How much policing is there? How much monitoring is there? Right? So what do you think in African countries where incomes are lower, GDP per capita is lower, are they going to be able to be overly ambitious at policing? Would be probably very hard to have an incredible presence, especially when we're talking about huge amounts of land in really rural areas. So policing might be hard. So how much policing is there might influence my ability or willingness to poach. What else, Ben?
Culture?
Culture. Tell me about what you mean by that.
Well, as we just mentioned, in some cultures, it's more acceptable to kill these animals for medicine or practices.
Okay, culture matters. So maybe you live in a country where it's not as taboo to kill an animal, where maybe we harvest for medicinal purposes. Give me something else. Montana.
I guess the demand for ivory.
Ah, demand for ivory. Demand for ivory. And what variable specifically? Price, right? Market price, right? The market price of ivory. Good. So you can imagine there's lots of factors that influence poaching. And there's been studies on this. So some of the things that tie in, and what I have found in the literature, some studies talk about need, poverty rates. A country's poverty rates might influence poaching, right? If everybody is wealthy, then you might not see as much poaching. But where poverty rates are high, where people can change their circumstances and the circumstances of their family, that incentive to poach might be a little greater. So we're back to that. Remember, wealthier is healthier and better for the environment. I'm not saying poaching problems go away, but we know that poverty breeds illegal activity. You were going to add something else, Jake?
Yeah, just to kind of add on to him what he was saying about culture. I know I've seen videos where like elephants can be pretty destructive to things like farms and villages.
Exactly, and we're going to talk about that you need to protect yourself personally and your personal property, and I have some pictures for you as well. That's a good answer, that just trying to protect yourself and your property. So we'll get to that in a slide or so. So poverty rates, the reward, somebody already mentioned that, the price of ivory, demand for ivory, price of ivory, clearly is going to matter. So as the price of ivory rises, what happens? Are we going to see more poaching or less poaching? Clearly more poaching, right? The reward goes up. I'm more willing to take risks when the reward is much higher, right? Risk. So somebody talked about this. What's the risk going to be for me? And this is going to be tied to the investment in monitoring. I think that was Jake's words, I think. The punishment that I might undergo in some countries. It's been okay for rangers to shoot poachers on site, so the punishment would be pretty heavy there. So if you perceive the punishment being much stricter, maybe less likely to take the risk, hard to say. But do you think it also ties into our political situations and our political institutions? How much corruption is there in a highly corrupt society? It might be easier to poach. You might even have some connections to government if you're in a highly corrupt environment. So studies have found these things to statistically explain levels of poaching, and the results have been really robust. So those of you in econometrics understand and will really understand soon what I talked about. If we were able to control for all these variables in a model, we'd be able to show that these are highly statistically significant in the right direction as predicted to explain levels of poaching. So this right here is an interesting graphic, and these are pike estimates, and pike estimates, pike stands for proportion of illegal kills estimates. Proportion of illegal kills estimates. And this is using a really sophisticated model. We're not interested in getting into the nuts and bolts associated with the methodology, but what we're seeing is that there have been some big increases in illegal kills. If you look at the bottom graphic, you see that here they're tracking the top line, all deaths, because not all deaths are going to be from illegal manners, right? All elephant deaths, and on the bottom, illegal kills in red. So what we see is that illegal kills explains a pretty large portion of the elephant deaths, right? Does that make sense? So in the top graphic, it's estimating proportion. So take one look and you can kind of see how these go together. So the top graphic on the vertical axis is proportion. So what proportion of all kills comes from illegal kills? And then the second graphic is showing you all kills versus illegal kills. And you see a same kind of thing, right? Illegal kills comprises a pretty large portion of all elephant deaths. But I'm pointing this out because I want you to understand one thing, because it's going to be relevant as we go forward. Let's look at the bottom graphic, the difference between all deaths and illegal kills. So there is some number of either natural death or culled elephants. So let's talk about culling for a second. Who's heard that term, culling? C-U-L-L-I-N-G, culling. So if we were to go in and cull our Virginia deer population, what would we be doing? Jake, say it again.
Killing them, decreasing the population.
Killing them, to kind of selectively killing them, right, to thin out the population. And so in some areas, there is culling of elephants, especially maybe when you're in areas of high drought where there's a lot of competition for food. Maybe you go in and you cull the older elephants. So if you went in as the government and you culled the older elephants, would it be legal to take their ivory? Would it be legal to take the ivory? Absolutely. If government officials, rangers, come across an elephant that died of natural causes, could they harvest the ivory? And would that be legal to do so? Yes. So I want to point this out so that we can make a distinction between illegally obtained ivory and legally obtained ivory, because that's going to matter in some of our future discussions. Does that make sense to everyone? So we see a huge proportion of deaths that are for reasons that are illegal, like poaching, but there is also a source of ivory from legal channels, culling and natural deaths. All right. Another risk to elephants, and Jake got us going down in this pathway, is conflicts with humans. And we're talking about non-poachers. So just simple conflict with humans. So another risk, we've got poachers, but we also have to acknowledge that simple conflict with humans causes a lot of risk and creates risk. So we need to think about what kind of damage can an elephant do? What kind of damage could an elephant do? Think about the sheer size of an elephant. And I don't know if you've ever stood next to one, but if you've ever stood next to one, they are enormous. And they look cute and cuddly, and Asian elephants are. African elephants, not as much. So Asian elephants can be domesticated. African elephants, not so much. So what kind of damage could an elephant do in a rural village? Gracia, what's one thing they could do? Eat all the crops, right? Eat all the crops. What else could they do, Kelsey? Damage the property, like the houses. Do you think people that live in rural Africa live in these big brick homes? What kind of houses do you think they live in? They're made of thatch, right? And from the materials that they're able to harvest, wood, they're going to have thatched roofs. So you're talking about fairly simple structures. Do you think it would be easy for an elephant to destroy that? Absolutely. So they can clearly destroy homes. They can uproot entire orchards. They can destroy crops. One way by just simply eating them. But they can also wreck irrigation systems. So where villages do have irrigation systems, everyone agree they're going to be fairly rudimentary systems. These are not going to be super sophisticated systems. So they can wreck irrigation systems. But on top of that, they can trample or gore people. What does it mean to be gored by an elephant? Stabbed with the tusk. Yes, stabbed with the tusk. And guys, every year there are deaths by elephant. It's a real thing. So Folks, if you are living in rural Africa, are the elephants your buddies? No, they offer a lot of threats. So I found some pictures showing damage by elephants. And so if you've never seen a thatched hut, that's what you see on the left. And you see you're using trees that you've harvested, you're using clay. So you might make some bricks from clay that you're able to get. And then your roof might be thatched. Very easy for an elephant to do a lot of damage here. So I was just doing a little reading online and I found this story, and this was from 2017, and the heading was, "Man Kills Elephant to Protect His Crop." All right. And so it explains a rural villager in Namibia's Caprivi Strip has shot and killed a bull elephant that was raiding his crops and reportedly attacked him. The incident happened on the outskirts of Mushangara village, which is situated within Babawata, I don't know if I've said that right, National Park, where incidents of human-animal conflict are frequent. So guys, is it all about poaching? Is it only about poaching? No, it's also about just human survival and trying to make sure that you can feed your family and keep them safe. So I found this great quote, and this is about, they were talking specifically about Tanzania. It said, "Once an elephant herd enters a field, they eat all the crops in a few hours. After such an incident, residents suffer food shortages, and out of necessity, they have to spend less on things such as their children's education or on medical expenses, and prioritize food purchases. Indeed, villagers' quality of life significantly deteriorates because of the elephant raids. Moreover, encounters with the elephants can sometimes be deadly. In 2015, and this was talking about just this district, 4 people were killed in the district." So, elephants are a nuisance, right? They are fun for you and me to see at zoos. And when I take my students to Thailand, they're super fun to feed. And we can cuddle with them, Asian elephants. But they can be quite a nuisance. So I thought this was kind of fun. This was from The Sun, which is from the United Kingdom. But it was a ranking of the world's deadliest animals. And I just pulled this for fun. But notice, you've got sharks, wolves, lions, and then huge jump up to elephants. And this was talking about number of kills, and it wasn't a very well-explained graphic, but I just thought it was kind of fun. Look what's at the very top, though. Mosquitoes, right? Why mosquitoes?
Malaria.
Yeah, malaria, dengue, and then a few years ago, who has heard of chikungunya? So chikungunya started spreading in Central America right before my group was going to Dominican Republic. There's no cure. There's no immunization for dengue, for chikungunya. Luckily, there's some prevention for malaria. All right, so again, that was just kind of for fun. So clearly, guys, we all understand and we all agree that the market for ivory matters. The market for ivory matters. So let's talk about the market for ivory. So in the 1970s, the prices of ivory are relatively low. You can still make some good money, but they're relatively low compared to more modern times. So in the 1970s, we see pretty low prices for ivory, but we have to remember, in impoverished African nations, low prices still might generate a huge income for people. So while they are low on American standards, on European standards in Africa, where we're seeing the poaching take place, a poacher could conceivably earn a year's salary good salary with just 1 kill. So you could make some serious money, even back in '70 when prices were low. And we've seen prices rise. And we've seen them rise very drastically. So in 1986, and guys, I had to pull across different sources. I was hoping to find a great graphic tracking ivory prices. Like if you wanted to track oil prices, that's easy to do. It's a global commodity. Ivory is, I just could not find a place to do it. So I pulled across multiple sites. But in 1986, it appears that we were seeing prices around $34 a pound. Now at $34 a pound, that's still fairly lucrative. By year 2000, we were seeing prices, and this is an observation that came from the Japanese market. I found prices between $65 and $145 a pound. So in 1986, $34. By year 2000, what's happened to price? It's more than doubled, right? More than doubled. Ben, did you have a question? Okay. So price has more than doubled in just 14 years in this period of time. So for a set of tusks, so 1 elephant killed, you get obviously 2 tusks. And for the pair, again, depends on the size of the elephant, they can weigh between, together, 180 to 250 pounds. So for a pair of tusks, you've got a lot of ivory. So you can do the math, and you see that 1 kill would generate in the market between $16-ish thousand and $36-ish thousand. Now guys, does that seem like a big payout? Big payout in rural Africa? Sure. And this is when prices are still reasonably low. But that's a big payout. So can you see how poverty would be a driving factor in poaching? Do we understand why studies get this highly robust result that poverty has a lot of explanatory power with explaining poaching levels? Sure. So a poacher could earn many years of salary from 1 kill in 2000. But that's before prices skyrocketed. So even before prices skyrocketed, this is lucrative. But as prices go up, this gets even more lucrative. So I found data from 2016. And in 2016, I found multiple sources saying that ivory was fetching up to $1,500 per pound, again on the black market. It's a black market at this point because ivory trade has been banned at this point. We'll talk about the banning of ivory trade. So we have this highly lucrative black market price of $1,500 a pound. So multiply that by the size of the tusks, and you're talking about $375,000 if we're looking at a pair of the largest tusks. Now, of course, there's a scarcity of bigger elephants, so maybe I'm not going to get that much with certainty, but geez, if I got half that much, that's still an enormous sum of money. Again, in countries that still aren't rich. Yeah?
Sorry, what is ivory used for?
So why do people want ivory? It's used symbolically for cultural things like stamps in China and Japan. If you and I were signing a document, we might use a stamp that's carved for us. It's kind of part of the tradition. Jewelry, carving, statue, it's used in art. So I'll show you some pictures, maybe not in this presentation, but that's a good question, and I probably should have explained that already. But the demand for ivory is that it's a culturally used thing for symbolic things, signing of contracts, for jewelry, for art forms. It's a beautiful, beautiful medium if you've ever seen any. Another thing that we need to add to this, guys, that a lot of people don't realize with poaching is that it's a highly organized activity. Often, you're not talking about just some guy by himself out there, unconnected to anyone else, doing the poaching. We're talking about organizations that have gotten themselves together for this very purpose. And unfortunately, there are plenty of sources that link poaching to rebel groups and organized crime. So poaching is used as a way of funding the activities of some rebel groups and organized crime, which makes sense because it's highly lucrative, right? So I found some examples. Al-Shabaab, which is Somalia-based Al-Qaeda, and you guys have heard of the Lord's Resistance Army, right? Which is a rebel group in Uganda. They fund some of their activities from revenues associated with poaching. And you'll find lots of sources that discuss this. So this seems to be pretty sound in terms of this conclusion. So Somalia's based Al-Qaeda branch, the Lord's Resistance Army, poaching, highly organized, illicit activities to bring in money for their enterprises. And then, in my reading, this was kind of fun, the Chinese mafia. We don't think about mafia being in other countries, guys, but you have mafia in other countries. It's not unique to our history. But the Chinese mafia are involved in not so much the poaching themselves, but in the distribution networks to sell the ivory in the black market. So there's, unfortunately, highly organized, well-funded organizations that are undertaking these poaching activities to try to fund their missions. So unfortunately, as the data seems to suggest, poaching became somewhat commonplace. Poaching became somewhat commonplace. So it's kind of akin to overfishing in our common waters, right? So poaching became somewhat commonplace, like overfishing, according to some authors. So we have our tragedy of the commons, right? Our tragedy of the commons. And I know you guys already understand that the tragedy of the commons is connected to the free rider problem. We've already talked about that in our example of overgrazing, right? If you're the only one that overgrazes, you're acting as a free rider, and if you're the only one doing it on some common parcel of land, then it's not going to be a problem. But is that how it's going to work, where just one person overgrazes? Everyone has that same incentive. I'm better off if I put more sheep on the land. You're better off when you put more sheep on the land. So same kind of situation with poaching. So we can ask the question, does a poacher have an incentive to limit his kills in order to help maintain a healthy elephant population? I mean, after all, his living is coming from poaching elephants. He wants to do it not just now, but in the future. Does the poacher have an incentive to limit his kills?
Long term.
Long term. But does he have that incentive long term? So let's say we're all poachers. Jake, you're going to go, oh, I'm not going to kill this guy because I want to think about the long-term health of this population. That'd be great, but what's going to happen, guys, when Jake says, oh, I'm not going to kill it? Ben's going to kill it, or Montana's going to kill it, or Brooke's going to kill it, right? So the problem is, and this is kind of what we've seen with things like bluefin tuna, right? If I try to act responsibly and monitor myself and limit my own behavior, does it do any good? No, because if I don't kill the elephant, somebody else is going to kill the elephant. If I don't catch the bluefin tuna without regulations being in place, you're going to catch that bluefin tuna. So I'd rather it be me than you. So there's not going to be anybody thinking about the long term, right? We're only thinking about the short term. And hence we have the tragedy associated with the comments. So let's move on to talk about attempts to control the situation. So we have to talk about CITES and their actions from 1986. Now you're going to be learning more about CITES specifically and about listing of species and that kind of stuff, but we're going to keep it simple at this point. But CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And there's actually, at the end of that very long name, a lot of times it's dropped, it's in flora and fauna. So plants and animals. It's not just animals. So, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES, meets in 1986. Now, CITES is a United Nations entity. So when you see me refer to the United Nations, this is why. This is a United Nations entity. And so CITES meets in 1986 to discuss concerns with the elephants. Now, before we talk about what they decided, you're going to learn more about the structure, but there are member nations. So a whole lot of countries are members of CITES. So when I say they meet to discuss, who meets to discuss? The member nations that are part of CITES. So the member nations discuss the concerns about the elephants, and they agree that they've got to do something. What are they going to do? They're going to adopt a quota system. They're going to adopt a quota system. All right, that sounds good. Adopt a quota system. So the idea with the quota is to limit trade in ivory. Well, that makes sense. We're just going to put a quota in place on ivory trade and limit how much trade can take place. All right, not a horrible idea. And guys, you're probably familiar with the idea of quotas from studying international trade. Maybe it came up in your macro class, or you've already had international econ. But quotas can work. We have quotas on lots of things, right? We have quotas, for example, on how much sugar can come into our country. And it works. But with a quota, monitoring is key. Monitoring is key. So with a quota, monitoring is key. So the bottom line is that a program like a quota or a policy or regulations only as successful as its monitoring and enforcement, right? So let's look at how a quota would work. And so you're going to want to get some graphics into your notes because I don't have them in the handout. So I want you to learn how to draw a quota. So let's start with the market for ivory here. And so you see our downward sloping demand curve and our upward sloping supply curve. And we have a market price of P1 and a quantity of Q1. So this is prior to the quota. So we're not imposing any quota at this point. Market price is P1. Amount of ivory trade is Q1. All right? So let's start with our market before we have a quota. So price is P1, quantity is Q1. We understand that. But now what we want to do is impose a quota. Impose a quota. Now remember, a quota is a fixed quantity, right? So when we have a quota on sugar, we're fixing the amount of sugar that can come in. So what we're doing here is we're fixing the quantity of ivory that can be traded. We're fixing the quantity of ivory that can be traded. But does everyone agree the idea with a quota is to lower quantity, right? So what does that tell us about the quota in relation to Q1? Our quota amount has to be what? Below or less than Q1. That makes sense. So the quota's got to be below Q1, or else it doesn't have the effect what we want it to do, is to lower quantity. So our quota has to be below Q1. But do you agree, guys, that the quota is not relevant if our quantity is below the quota, right? Does that make sense? The quota doesn't do anything if ivory trade is below the quota amount. It's when we hit the quota amount. Does that make sense? So if we're way below the quota really doesn't do anything until we get to the quota level. So I've just imposed a quota amount at Q2. So everyone saw that? So let's say that we're going to impose a quota at Q2. Everybody with me? We're going to impose a quota at Q2. It's below Q1, so it's going to meet, hopefully, my goal of lowering trade below where it is now. Now it's at Q1. We want it to be Q2. So let's let the quota be at Q2. And we all agree it's less than the current. So that makes sense. And we agree that the quota only kicks in when we get to Q2. Everyone agree with that? And I keep emphasizing this because it's going to give us a funky looking supply curve, because below the quota versus at the quota. So the quota creates this weird kinked supply curve. So take a look at that and draw it in thick or draw it in with a different color or something, because it's a new supply curve. So see that I've labeled it supply curve S2, and it's kinked. So let's look at that for a second. So catch up with me, and then everyone look up here when you're caught up. All right, so guys, look below Q2. If we're below Q2, the quota doesn't have any impact. So we would just be on the previous supply curve, right? S1. So the supply curves are the same if we're below the quota. But as soon as we get to the Q2th unit, right, when we get to Q2, oh, we can't have any more trade, that supply curve becomes vertical. Why is it vertical? Because a vertical supply curve is a fixed quantity. It's a fixed supply, right? So that's why we have that pivot at point Q2. So below Q2, the quota doesn't apply, but it does apply at Q2, giving us the vertical fixed quantity. So that's where we get that kinked supply curve from. So guys, what has happened to price as a result of our quota? Yeah, everyone agree that price has now gone up. Price has gone up because we've got to find our new intersection between our new red supply curve and demand. So price is now P2. So guys, if we impose this quota and price of ivory now goes up, how does this influence illegal trade and poaching? Does it lower it, or does it increase the incentive? Yeah, everyone agreed it increases the incentive. So this quota bid the price of ivory up. And when we bid the price of ivory up, it gives us a greater incentive to poach. So that's maybe not the incentive we wanted to set. So I found this historical document from 1987, and this is a CITES document. And so this is the 6th meeting of the Conference of the Parties. It's in Canada. It's July 1987. And they are looking at interpreting and implementing this quota system. So there's nothing really that important on that slide other than that this is the document that I'm sourcing right here. So what we have here is a list of the ivory export quotas. So I thought this was kind of funny that you can see who has quotas and see who doesn't have quotas. So guys, why would some countries have 0? They don't have any elephants. Okay, so not all countries in Africa are going to be participating in this quota system, but you've got this total set. Now, here's the interesting thing. Look at the fine print to the right. It says, quotas are to be submitted to the Secretariat in writing by December 1 for the next calendar year, blah, 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 blah. What is that suggesting? That they get to have a role in setting their quota. Exactly. Which is kind of weird, right? So maybe not to disenfranchise the member countries. The member countries get to be involved in setting the quota. Does that seem like it's incentive compatible?
No.
Yeah, that seems maybe problematic. And another thing we need to note is that countries were, as it says in yellow, able to sell off their stockpiled ivory. So governments might have these huge warehouses full of stockpiled ivory, but from legal sources, elephants that died of natural causes, they harvest the ivory, or culling, right? Thinning out the herds, harvesting the ivory. So you've got governments with stockpiles, so they have an incentive. Do you see how maybe kind of politics got involved here? Like, wait, I'm sitting on ivory, it's highly valuable, you're going to tell me what I can do? Okay, well, let's compromise. You guys can kind of set your quota. I can only imagine how this conversation might have gone, but clearly nations had this role in setting their quotas. So what you're seeing on the right here, these are kind of pictures of ivory warehouses where they're storing ivory. And that top picture, it just goes back super far. So governments are sitting on this huge amount of wealth, right? They want to be able to trade. But as part of this quota system, the tusks had to be stamped. Now, I don't know if writing on or literally stamped, so I found pictures that showed markings, like the picture on the bottom. I never found any pictures of actual, like, stamped, imprinted, so I don't know if that's what we're seeing in the bottom. But they had to be stamped, and that stamp had to indicate a serial number, a country code, so we know where the ivory came from and we can track it, the weight, and the year. So basically, we're trying to create this tracking system for ivory. You want to export ivory, it's got to be stamped, it's got to have a serial number, you've got to have your country's origin code, you've got to indicate the weight, you've got to indicate the year. And it's all tracked through a computer system. Okay, well, this makes sense. But do you agree? It all comes down to the quota amount. So for 1986, the quota was 90,000 tusks. 90,000 tusks. But that includes stockpiled ivory. So I'm reminding you of that because 90,000 tusks doesn't mean 45,000 new elephant kills, right? It means that you can take ivory from your stockpiles and you can trade it. The idea here is that over time, the quota would decrease. Over time, the quota would decrease. And that makes sense. So over time, we're going to decrease this quota. And hopefully at some point, we've kind of sold off our stockpiles. And then we don't have this pressure from governments, oh, we've got stockpiled ivory, this isn't fair, you're eliminating a lot of our wealth. So over time, let's let these countries sell off their stockpiles, and we're going to, over time, lower the quota. All right, seems like an okay plan. But not as successful. So this right here, again, part of the same document. The Secretariat has received several comments and is aware of newspaper articles concerning the registration of ivory stocks of illegal origin. So this is CITES admitting, okay, there seems to be this concern about ivory coming from illegal origins, suggesting that such ivory should not have been registered or should have been confiscated from the owners or subject to payment of a penalty or fine. Singapore and Burundi, countries which registered the largest stocks, have been identified in particular since all the ivory registered by Burundi and most of Singapore's stocks left the countries of origins illegally. Yada, 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 yada. All right, what's it suggesting here? Something has gone wrong. We're seeing illegal trade. So very quickly, to wrap up here, and then we'll stop for the day, this quota was unsuccessful. Why? Because we were still seeing high levels of illegal trade. High levels of illegal trade. There were simply too many elephants being killed, and I don't know how exactly they determine that, but they do a lot of counting of carcasses using some aerial photography and monitoring methods. So if you can count the kills, too many elephants killed, multiple reasons having to do with loopholes. There were some big loopholes in the system. And of course, lack of monitoring. Add to that corruption, and you have a problem. So let's stop there, guys, and we'll talk more about the loopholes in this program and then what happens next when we get together on Thursday.